Howdy, amateur astronauts. I hope you're enjoying our conversations on the awesomeness of space exploration. You might not know that Are We There Yet is supported by listeners just like you. So consider showing your support with a financial contribution to this station that produces Are We There Yet, WMFE. And you can do that by visiting wmfe.org/support. Your gift helps us better explore exploration. And thanks. From the studios at WMFE in Orlando, Florida, this is the Space Exploration Podcast that asks the question, are we there yet? Hi, I'm Brendan Byrne. You know, most of the time on this podcast, we're looking forward. We're looking to the future and all the neat stuff that's going to get us to Mars. Now, while this podcast asks the question, are we there yet? My next guest thinks an equally important question to ask is, how did we get here? Jason Davis is the digital editor at the Planetary Society. In his reporting series called Horizon Goal, Jason's looking at the events, starting in 2003, that led NASA to this point in our journey to put humans on Mars. He joins me by Skype to talk more about his reporting and this incredibly fascinating and plot twist-filled story of human space exploration. Jason, thanks for speaking with me.
Hey, thanks for having me. Big fan of the podcast. Just started listening to it, so I'm glad to come and talk to you about it.
Hey, love to hear that. Well, you know, I'm a big fan of your reporting, and one of the things that I just finished reading is the Horizon Goal reporting project, which you have partnered with the Huffington Post, and that kind of long-form reporting project, it starts at the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster, so I want to start the conversation there. Walk me through it. Let's go back to 2003. How did that shape the way NASA and other agencies looked back or looked at human spaceflight?
Yeah, so this had kind of been looming for a while, that as NASA started building the International Space Station and was getting it close to core complete, which they meant by that we mean just the main modules that comprise the core of the space station. They were already starting to look at what are we going to do after this for human spaceflight? What comes after the space station is finished? And what do we do with the shuttles? And where do we go from here? But at the same time, the ISS was over budget, a little behind schedule, and they bring in Administrator Sean O'Keefe to kind of take a look at the whole program and get it back on track. And he was a guy, he's a self-professed bean counter, really good at the numbers and getting programs back on track in big federal projects like that. So he comes in and he's got what he thinks is the solution to get it all ready to go. And NASA's new budget comes out every February. And O'Keefe has the new plan. He's ready to unveil it. And he's actually at Kennedy Space Center when the shuttle's supposed to come back, when Columbia's supposed to come back. He's there with the families at the landing strip. Then the tragedy happens, as we all know. The shuttle doesn't make it back. A piece of foam had punctured it, and hot plasma during re-entry got in there and broke the shuttle apart. And it's this horrible tragedy. And at the same time, O'Keefe's big plan for restructuring the ISS program is completely out the door at that point, because it's going to be a couple years before the shuttle gets flying again. And so everything's in kind of disarray. So that's the point where a lot of folks at NASA and also in the federal government really start looking at taking a long, hard look at human spaceflight and saying, what are we doing here? Why? What is the purpose of flying humans into space? This is the second time we've lost a space shuttle with all the people aboard, and is this worth it? What's the purpose of all this? And so they really do some hard soul searching. And according to O'Keefe, whom I spoke to for this story, all options were on the table, including, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this anymore. Maybe we should actually wind down the human spaceflight program. So it really was a time at the agency there for less than a year where they really took a long look at human spaceflight.
Because this had been the second tragedy on the shuttle program, right?
Yeah, second time. Obviously, Challenger in 1986. So they take a look at all of this and put all these options on the table. And the Bush administration at the time, decides, hey, well, let's change direction here. Let's come up with a way to move beyond the space shuttle. We got to finish the ISS, and then we're going to look at the next big thing. So in January 2004, Bush gives this big, grand, sweeping speech at NASA headquarters. And when the president speaks about a NASA issue, no matter who the president is at the time. This is a big deal for us in the space community because space flight and NASA don't play a huge role in the grand scheme of presidential politics. So these tend to be big watershed moments, and this was no exception. So Bush says, here's the plan, and this had been laid out with NASA, that we're going to finish the ISS by 2010, then we're going to retire the space shuttles, and then we're going to set our sights for beyond low Earth orbit. We're going to, we've been in low Earth orbit since the end of the Apollo era, and we're going to move out beyond low Earth orbit and head back to the moon. We're going to build a new crew vehicle. It was not very well defined at that point what this crew vehicle would look like, but they're going to move back to lunar space, land on the moon by 2020, if not earlier, according to the original plans. And use the moon as kind of this semi-permanent staging ground where we might even go beyond that and go to Mars or something like that. So it was one of the, this had been something that had been kicked around since the Apollo days. Hey, when are we going back to the moon? When are we getting out of low Earth orbit again? But this was a pretty major initiative for the president to, come up with this plan and create kind of this watershed moment for how NASA is going to move forward after Columbia.
That's right, and that kind of laid the ground for the Constellation program, right?
Yeah, so OKeefe, Administrator OKeefe, his vision, so it was this big, bold plan, but the details were not quite finalized. So the timelines were all there, but exactly how they were going to do it was, a little to be determined. So O'Keefe's vision was that, hey, we will focus on new technologies. We'll put NASA to work on these advanced things that we know we need to solve to move farther into deep space. Things like advanced nuclear propulsion, things like heavy lift, which is something NASA is working on right now, being able to heave massive amounts of cargo into orbit. And it wasn't really explicitly stated during the O'Keefe administration, but the implication was that for low Earth orbit, NASA would probably just buy rockets rather than building a whole new rocket system. And really the only viable alternatives at that point were the Atlas V and the Delta IV, or some modified version of that. And there was no United Launch Alliance back then, the Boeing-Lockheed conglomerate that now launches those rockets. So it was going to have to be some combination of those. But the plan wasn't really thought out. And, O'Keefe was going to kind of take it slow and look at all the technologies carefully and start developing the concrete steps down the road. But at the end of that year, 2004, O'Keefe decides to take the chancellorship position at Louisiana State University and move on to something else. So Bush lays this timeline, O'Keefe gets the plan going, this Constellation plan, and then O'Keefe leaves. So it's that left the door open for someone else was going to have to come into NASA and actually oversee the execution of this plan.
Now, the Constellation program and what it kind of turned into is a very interesting story. We won't spoil it for people that are following along with your reporting, so we're going to go ahead and jump through time at this point. Definitely look for Jason's piece on the Constellation program, the evolution of that. But let's go ahead and jump to today. Now the program is, NASA's journey to Mars. There's the development of SLS, the development of Orion, the development of these ground systems to support all this stuff. One thing that I gathered from your reporting, and one of the subtitles you had in the story was, "It's a bold plan with details to be determined." What's been the holdup with the development of this plan? We're getting the hardware, we've got the technology, we've got the know-how. Why can't we settle on where to go and when?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting as I've researched this and started writing these pieces that there are a lot of parallels to what we just talked about with Constellation and the Bush vision for space exploration, and to what's happening today, as you're alluding to, with the whole journey to Mars thing. It's a bold plan, but the details are not quite there. So today, the main reasons that we see NASA kind of waffling on this, a lot of it has to do with historically, it has not gone well for NASA when they try to lay out an end-to-end plan that spans a decade or more, and has these really ambitious architectures that get us to a certain destination like Mars. And an example of this, about 20 years ago, or I may be a little off on the timeline there, but this was attempted. There was an initiative to go back to Mars, and I'm not as versed in the details of this as I am on some of Constellation and SLS, but there was a 90-day study, one of these things where the president comes out and says, "Hey, let's focus on Mars." This was George H.W. Bush, and it says, "Let's come up with a plan to go back to Mars." NASA comes out with this kind of 90-day study on what it would take to get back to Mars. And unfortunately, along with that, they throw out a price tag. The price tag in this case was $500 billion. Now, there's been a lot written on this subject on whether or not that price tag was remotely accurate, whether the NASA centers that were involved in this proposal were, using it, where they were looking at costs correctly, whether they were just kind of throwing numbers out there and saying this is the Rolls-Royce of Mars plans, kind of assuming they had another Kennedy moment almost, where the government was opening up their checkbook to say, you do whatever you need to get us to Mars, we'll pay for it. And so that cost figure kind of became infamous for NASA, and essentially the first Bush administration said, "Forget it. We're not going to support this." Congress howled about that much money being spent, and that plan kind of quickly faded away. So NASA kind of has learned the hard way not to lay things out too explicitly, because that makes them vulnerable to cancellation. We've kind of seen this a little bit with the asteroid redirect mission, which is pretty controversial at this point, where NASA would go pluck a boulder from an asteroid, bring it back to to lunar orbit, and then go explore it with Orion. NASA's kind of moved development on that very slowly. Whether or not that project actually survives into the next presidential administration is hard to say. But they are really cautious about laying out long-term plans, because the first thing we reporters want to know is, what's it going to cost? And NASA has kind of learned its lesson that they say if they drop a cost figure like that down, even if they say, well, $500 billion over 30 years, it just kind of, the sticker shock is too much for Congress. And another reason that these details are kind of to be determined is that some of them, they really don't know. With the 20-year time frame on this, so NASA says, hey, we're going to land on Mars in the 2030s. Unfortunately, the technologies available in the 2030s are going to look a lot different than they look now. And NASA is on a flat budget. They don't, typically, if you want to build some grand, expensive, ambitious program, you throw a lot of money at it up front, because that's your development costs, and you're building all the plans for these things, and you're constructing the pieces that you need. And then when you move into an operational phase, when you're actually doing the stuff, it tends to get a little cheaper. So you kind of see this hump if you're graphing it out, dollars versus time. And what's happening here is NASA does not get that hump. They are on a very flat budget, because Congress and the White House have not thrown the dollars behind this that NASA would like. So because of that, they can't put all this development stuff up front. They can't start even thinking about the pieces that are required for landers on Mars and human habitats on Mars. I mean, they do, but they're very preliminary plans, because they just don't have the money to spend on a lot of development on that. So instead, what they've done is kind of switch to what they call a capabilities approach. So right now, they're focused on SLS and Orion, because they know, or at least their plan says, that any missions to Mars are going to require these two things. We're going to need a giant rocket that can lift a lot of weight into orbit, and we're going to need a little crew capsule that can get our people back through the atmosphere. Those are two essential components. So once we have those capabilities built, tested, flying, we'll move on to the next capability. And that's kind of maddening for you and I, or for the casual observer, saying, well, what's the grand plan? And NASA's saying, well, we're not going to create one yet. We're going to take it one step at a time. So I think that's kind of the reason you don't see these details crystallize at this point.
I mean, one can make the argument that that could be the downside of something like that, is that you're not getting that public interest in the program because you don't have a goal, and that public interest trickles to the Congress people that are funding the program, and if you don't have that, you don't get the money to begin with, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. It's kind of a catch-22 situation there, and you see when NASA tries to. They try to say, if you ask NASA what's the plan for Mars, they will point you to this Journey to Mars document they have that looks very convincing at first glance, and I'm sure they want Congress people to see that and say, "Oh, look at this plan, this Journey to Mars plan." But when you start parsing it and reading into it, the details are not really there. So I think you're absolutely right. It's difficult to simultaneously gain public support for something like that while not defining the details.
Now, there's also been criticism over the plan to build the new rocket system, SLS. We were talking before the program, SLS is a very polarizing topic. It's either a really, really good thing that NASA's building a new rocket, or other people think this is a complete waste of time and money. I mean, where do you stand on SLS, and is this the right direction that we should be going in for our exploration efforts?
Sure. So this is a tough situation for me personally because I love space. I love big rockets. I mean, I love any rockets, but I'm not going to lie. If SLS flies in 2018 as it's supposed to, and I get to go down to KSC and cover it, which I absolutely plan to do, I mean, that's going to be one of the coolest things ever to see that rocket lift off. On the other hand, I can look at that objectively and say, is this the way NASA is doing this? Is this the absolute most efficient way to get us to Mars? And the answer, I think pretty objectively, is no, it's probably not. There's probably better ways we could be doing these things. But unfortunately, you have to look at it in the context of what it is, and that it's a government-run program. It's very important jobs-wise to a lot of for senators with parochial interests in the South. There's about 5 human spaceflight centers from Florida to Texas that are really have a lot of money invested in this thing and providing a lot of people with jobs. And so when you have a government spaceflight program like this, that's just going to be the reality of the situation, is that you're going to get this push and pull, this give and take on what Congress thinks you should do, what NASA thinks you should do. And as a result, you're probably not going to end up with the most efficient space program possible. And you could say that for many federal projects. At the risk of sounding like some libertarian or something here, I think that's just kind of the reality of the situation. So I accept the fact that that it may not be the best way to do it, but it is a way to do it. And the Planetary Society, my employer, obviously, that's kind of the approach they've taken with their advocacy direction. They have a plan called Humans Orbiting Mars, and that's to get humans in orbit around Mars on an early orbital mission before landing, and that would be in the early 2030s. And that plan relies on SLS and Orion. And so their argument is, well, this big rocket, it's just a fact of life that if NASA's going to do this, this is the way it's going to happen, whether or not it's the most efficient way to do it. And so we might as well use this capability. We might as well try to make the best of this situation. And I realize that's a waffly, more nuanced take on the situation than just saying it's the worst thing ever or the best thing ever. But I think, unfortunately, that's just kind of the reality you get with these government space programs.
Now, you've alluded to this throughout the conversation, but NASA is about to experience a presidential administration change. What does that actually mean, on the ground for NASA administrators? What's the process when we elect a new president in office?
Yes. So this is something I'm very interested in because 8 years ago I was not reporting on space or following the space program the way I am today. So as part of this Horizon Goal series we're doing, I've looked into what happened during the Bush-Obama transition. And having learned a lot about that and what happened behind the scenes, I'm very interested to see how this goes, whoever our next president is. So the short answer is that we really don't know what kind of impact it'll have. It really does depend on a lot of things. Neither candidate has really come out with any strong indications of what they would do with NASA. That's not to say there might not be transition teams behind the scene already trying to influence possible policy decisions. But publicly, I think we had Donald Trump say, "I love the space program, but I want to fix our potholes or something on Earth." That's not a very clear policy statement. And I think we saw the Republicans and the Democrats issue kind of these generic statements on like supporting space and supporting commercial investment in space. So, it's publicly, there's not a clear guidance on what the transition would mean.
And thinking back to previous elections, I don't think I can remember a candidate in the past, let's say 3 or 4 elections or so that have come out and had a policy issue. It's not really something that's on the talking point list, right?
No, it's not going to. It is not. You're right. And unless you get, I think it was a Newt Gingrich running a few years ago that talked about a moon base or something like that. But that's the exception, not the rule. I think you're right. What will happen during the presidential administration change is that there are transition teams already that are looking at various issues in all aspects of government, probably including space policy. At least that's the way it was during the Obama administration in the lead up to the election. In Obama's case, his transition team was led by Lori Garver. She ended up becoming the deputy administrator of NASA early on in his administration. And she had a few people that were working with her to advise him on space policy issues. So Hillary Clinton being, such a political veteran, I can't imagine she doesn't have or won't quickly have a similar team advising her on, hey, this is what NASA is currently doing, and here's some things you could do with it. Donald Trump's kind of the wild card in all of this. I don't know to what extent he has transition teams, if any, looking at these kind of things. So that's, clearly all the rules have gone out the window on his campaign, and I would say that NASA is probably among that. But what will happen when the president is elected, they will have the opportunity to choose a new administrator. They'll have to nominate one, and that will go through the congressional vetting process, just like it would for any other nominee. And as we saw during the Obama administration, that even though it's NASA, and this is not, it's not like you're nominating a Supreme Court justice, you'd think, well, how contentious can this be? During the Obama administration, Charlie Bolden, as we now know, and we'll talk about this later on in the Horizon Goal series, was not his first choice. He had other candidates in mind. But by all accounts, Bolden was heavily favored by Senator Bill Nelson of Florida. And Obama very quickly found out that someone in his own party was pushing back against his nomination for NASA. And the president only has a finite amount of political capital to spend on pushing back against various interests and various members of Congress. And in this case, Obama chose not to spend his political capital on a NASA administrator and compromised, and they ended up going with Charlie Bolden. So the same thing will happen here. Whether or not Hillary Clinton has somebody specific in mind she wants as NASA administrator, it's hard to say. But she could, if she nominates somebody, people talk about, well, all you need is a good NASA administrator to get in there and totally revamp the way things are. But the senators that have power over shutting down that pick, they will speak up if they think it's somebody that's not going to be friendly to their district and the jobs in their district. And so there's give and take even on the NASA administrator nomination. And
Senator Bill Nelson, for those that don't know, he pulls a lot of weight in the space community because he's been to space.
Yes, and he flew to space with none other than Charlie Bolden.
So there's the connection there.
Yes.
The reporting project, it's as we said, it's a part of a multi-part series. What's the next part? What can we expect? And where can our listeners go to read this?
Yeah, so our next piece is going to cover Constellation after Administrator O'Keefe left office and Michael Griffin took over as his successor. So there's this perception, people look back on Constellation and say it was over budget and behind schedule. We're going to examine those claims as best we can and say, is that true? And to what extent were they over budget and behind schedule? And kind of set the stage for part 3, which will be the transition between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And we'll talk about Lori Garver's influence and plans to change direction with Constellation and where things went from there. So we published the series at both planetary.org and on the Huffington Post website. The URL for the Planetary Society is planetary.org/horizon goal. We put all the stories there. And of course, follow us on Twitter and all the usual ways through planetary.org, and we'll keep you up to date on how it's coming.
It's really a great series, and if anything, check it out just to see O'Keefe's mustache. As a facial hair aficionado, that man has a great mustache.
He does. He has a fantastic mustache.
Well, I've been speaking with Jason Davis. He's been writing for the Horizon Goal series. He's the digital editor at the Planetary Society. Jason, a pleasure. Thanks for speaking with me.
Thanks so much for having me, Brendan. It's really been fun.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Support for Are We There Yet comes from the listeners of WMFE. Follow the show online or on Twitter, AEWTY Mars, that's short for Are We There Yet, or reach out to me in the Twitterverse. I'm at SpaceBrendan. Leave us a review on iTunes. That's how more people learn about this podcast. Are We There Yet is a production of WMFE in Orlando. Our theme music was composed by Kevin McLeod. For more space news, find it online at WMFE.org/space. I'm Brendan Byrne. Thanks for listening.